Hey all, so for part one of this tutorial, Consuming REST API, we'll be taking a look at the openweathermap.org REST API to get some really cool weather data, specifically by zip code. We'll be setting up a really simple REST action inside a Mendix project, and then we'll run a basic test on that API call just to make sure we're getting the right data, that it's set up properly, and then we'll take it a bit further later on in the video. So let's get started. Great, so over in the modeler, I've got a very basic demo project set up. I've got a landing page here where a user will create or click a new request. A new request record gets created. This request record is very basic. It just contains a zip code and a unit of measure that they'll want the results returned in. And then we pass that into another simple page. The user can enter in the zip code, select the unit of measure, and then we'll make the API call. So this is the microflow we'll spend a couple minutes on here during this video to show you how to get that set up. Okay, so in my microflow, the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of that message, and I'm going to add a new action activity. If I double click that activity, I'm going to search for REST. I'm going to select the call REST service action. In my location, I've already grabbed my endpoint from the documentation on the openweathermap.org API, and I've done some testing previously with this in Postman. Postman is a great tool to test and use APIs. It's free to use, gets a lot of great features, and oftentimes I'll mess around with that, the API in Postman before coming over into Mendix, into the project, just to make sure I've got things configured properly, my endpoints set up properly, my API key is enabled, all that good stuff. It's just easier to test it in Postman first, and then move over to the modeler. So I've got my endpoint here, and if you notice, I've got a couple of hard-coded values just from when I was doing that testing over in Postman. So I'm going to replace those with what will be some parameters. That way my data here will be a little bit more dynamic. I can add different values, do some more testing. So my first parameter is going to be my request zip. My next one is going to be my request unit of measure, and lastly I've got an open weather API key. So I've set that up as a constant already in my project, so that'll be my third parameter. So this endpoint looks pretty good to me. I left the US piece that's hard-coded in there for now. I can go back and change that later if I wanted to perhaps select different countries, but I'm going to leave it as just US for the time being. So hit OK in this window here. Here on this tab, on the call REST action, I'm going to leave everything else the same. It's a GET request by default. I've got my endpoint location here. The only other thing I'm going to adjust right now is the response. So I click the response tab. I want to be able to check out what sort of data I'm getting back. Just confirm it looks similar to what I was doing in Postman. So I'm going to store my response in an HTTP response. So I'll just change that to the name of the variable to response, so it'll make a little more sense as I'm debugging and looking at the data. So great, so this looks pretty good to go. I'm going to go ahead and rerun the project and then we'll check it out. Alright, we rerun the project, and I'm going to throw a breakpoint on this action just so we can come back and check out what's going on in the microflow. So let's hop over and take a look at the landing page. I'm going to make a new request and punch in our zip code that we want to search for. I'll leave unit of measure just as is for the moment, but let's get some data. So we hit our breakpoint, excellent. Let's step over this action. It looks good, didn't hit any errors. Let's check out our response variables. I see a status code of 200, so that's a good sign. And in our content attribute, we actually see the response data. So it looks really good to me. It looks very, very similar to what we were seeing in Postman when I was doing the testing earlier. We see some weather information, temperatures, I see city, so all looks pretty good. So let's take this API to the next level. In the second half of this tutorial, we'll take that ugly, unformatted JSON string response and we'll use it to set up a JSON structure. And then we'll take that structure, we'll configure an import mapping with it, and that will really allow us to use the data we get back in the response, present it to the user in a meaningful, useful way. And Mendix makes this super easy to do that. So let's hop right in and we'll take a look how to do it. All right, so if we take this JSON string, we're just going to go ahead and copy it, and let's close out of that pop-up, and we can continue the call here. Great, so underneath I got a folder structure here. I'm going to throw in, I'm going to go right-click, add other, and I want to add a JSON structure. So we'll name this JSON underscore current weather by zip. And if we paste in our JSON structure, or excuse me, our JSON string, format it, great, now it becomes much more readable. We can see some of that data, which is really neat. And if we go down here to our structure, we hit refresh, and it reads this string and then creates a bit of a structure for us. So great. Then we're going to be now using this and apply it to an import mapping. So let's hit OK. We're going to save that. Under that same folder, right-click again, add other, and we're going to set up an import mapping. So let's rename this. We'll give it the same name. So it's current weather underscore by zip. Okay, so we got a couple of options here, but for this demonstration, this tutorial, we're going to click JSON structure, click select, and we'll select that JSON structure that we just set up just a moment ago. So we'll double click that, and it brings it into this schema here. And if we say expand all and then check all, and we'll just grab all of the data. And you may not always need to do this. There may be just specific pieces that you're looking for that you may not need. But for this exercise here, we're just going to grab everything and check it out. So let's grab it, hit OK, and now what we've got here, I'm going to switch to full screen. We've got sort of this JSON structure here. We see all of these JSON objects off on the right. And what I want to do is I don't want to spend time in the domain model setting up all these attributes and tables. I'm going to just click map automatically. So now, great, it's created in our database. If I go to right click and say go to entity, it's set up all of these non-persistent records here in our domain model. It doesn't quite format them very well, so you do probably want to spend a little bit of time just kind of organizing these so it makes sense when you go back to read it later. I won't do that for this tutorial here just because that does take a little bit of time, but just to kind of get these so they're a little bit more readable when you come back later. But for now, I'll leave them as is, and just so we can get and see some of the data here. So great, it created all those automatically. Let's save it, and the mapping is all set. So I'm going to close this here. All right, so back in our microflow, we're going to go ahead and double click this action, and in the response tab, let's change this to apply import mapping. So we select the import mapping that we just created a moment ago, and that's it. We leave everything as is for the moment. There's a lot of other settings that we could adjust and change, but for this exercise, we're just going to apply the import mapping, and we'll go from there. So let's hit OK. And so now what data do we actually want to use? What do we want to present to the user? Well, if we go back and take a look at the JSON structure itself, we get a number of objects here that we could choose to use and mess with. We've got coordinates, a table that's called weather, some other pieces here. We got main. That looks like something that we'd be interested in. This shows temperature. So let's take a look at that. We can do a retrieve to grab this main object and then present the temperature to the user. So let's hit cancel. So back in our microflow, let's add a very simple retrieve by association. And based off of our response, let's grab that main object. So main, that should give us access to the attribute temperature. And let's add a message for the user. Say, hey there, the current temp is, and we'll add a parameter. Our parameter will be main temp. And because that is a decimal, let's say to string. And let's check it out. Let's rerun the project. And we'll see what that looks like from a user's standpoint. We'll enter in our zip code, and we'll leave this breakpoint on for a moment because we'll get to step through this and kind of just see how this looks in the microflow. So let's view that. New request. We'll enter in our zip code, get weather, hit our breakpoint still, excellent. So we hit the API, great. We've got a response here. We retrieved the main there. We have a value in our temp attribute, excellent. And that should get passed to this pop-up. Step over, excellent. So the user gets to see, hey there, the current temp is 64.26 degrees. We could add a lot more to this. We could throw on the city, of course. We could throw on the unit of measure, all sorts of things that we could do now with this data. All right, well, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for checking out this tutorial. Of course, there's so much more you can do with REST APIs and Mendix. Hopefully this was just a helpful, high-level, quick start on how to get going consuming REST APIs with your Mendix projects. The next video, part 2, we'll take a look at how to publish REST services from within your Mendix apps for other apps to be able to consume. Thank you so much.